The email arrived at 6:42 in the morning, wedged between a grocery coupon and a calendar reminder I had already dismissed twice. It wasn't even addressed to me directly. It was a forwarded message from my aunt, one line added at the top. "Thought you should see this." That was it, no greeting, no explanation. I opened the attachment while standing in my kitchen, coffee still untouched, the sky outside my apartment in Portland barely awake. The invitation loaded slowly, the kind of glossy digital card people use when they want something to look important. Gold trim, formal script, my family's last name centered in bold, my brother's wedding. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the date. Early June, a Saturday, 3 weeks away. I hadn't been told. Not by my parents, not by my brother, not by anyone who claimed to love me. The omission was clean, efficient, almost professional. At first, I assumed there had been a mistake, a glitch, something clerical. That was my reflex for years, to give them the benefit of the doubt before allowing myself to feel anything sharp. I scrolled down, scanning the details: venue, schedule, dress code, RSVP instructions. The guest list wasn't visible, but I already knew. If I had been invited, I would have known weeks ago, months even. My mother would have made sure of it. She liked control disguised as consideration. She liked to feel involved. I closed the email and sat down at the table. The chair felt colder than usual. I didn't cry. That surprised me. Instead, there was a quiet pressure in my chest, the kind that comes from recognition rather than shock. This wasn't an accident. This was a decision. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages, nothing that suggested anyone had realized I existed that morning. I typed a message to my brother, then deleted it. Typed again, deleted again. What would I say? "Hey, just checking if I was intentionally erased from a major family milestone?" No, I already knew the answer. I went to work like nothing had happened. Sat through meetings, answered emails, presented a quarterly update to a room full of executives who nodded as if my voice carried weight. It did, just not where I came from. Around noon, my mother finally called. Her voice was warm, too warm. The kind of tone she used when she was steering a conversation before I knew what road we were on. "Sweetheart," she said, "I heard from your aunt that she forwarded you something. I wish she hadn't." I waited. "We didn't want you to feel hurt," she continued. "But with everything going on, we thought it might be best if you sat this one out." Sat this one out, as if my presence were optional. As if I were a substitute player who could be benched for convenience. "I wasn't told," I said calmly. "Well," she replied, "we knew you'd react, and this day isn't about you." There it was. The familiar deflection, the preemptive accusation. "You are too much. You complicate things." "I wasn't planning to make it about me," I said. She sighed softly, the sound of practiced patience. "You've been under a lot of stress. We just want peace." Peace. That word had been used on me like a leash my entire life. I said nothing. "That silence worries me," she added quickly. "You know we love you." I almost laughed. After we hung up, I sat at my desk staring at the wall, replaying the conversation, not for emotion, but for information. They hadn't asked how I felt. They hadn't apologized. They had decided. That was the pattern. The one I had been slow to name, because naming it meant accepting something final. This wasn't about the wedding. The wedding was just the surface. That night, I drove past my parents' house without stopping. The lights were on. Cars in the driveway. Planning, probably. Toasts. Seating charts. Conversations where my absence would be explained as concern. "She's been sensitive lately. We didn't want to overwhelm her. It was for the best." They would believe it too. I parked down the street and sat there, engine off, watching a family I belonged to operate smoothly without me. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to knock on the door. I felt something else. Distance. Not bitterness, not rage. Clarity. I realized then that being excluded wasn't the wound. Being managed was. I had spent years accepting decisions made on my behalf, convinced it was love. But love that removes your agency isn't care, it's control. The wedding was in 3 weeks. I wouldn't be there. But as I sat in the dark, something settled in me that hadn't before. If they could erase me from something this visible, then everything else I had assumed about my place in the family needed to be re-examined. And I had a feeling that when I did, nothing would look the same again. That was the morning everything began to unravel. Not loudly, but completely. The days after the invitation blurred into something deceptively normal. I woke up, I went to work, I answered messages, I laughed at the right moments. From the outside, nothing had changed, but internally something fundamental had shifted. A lens had been removed, and without it, everything looked sharper and less forgiving. I didn't bring up the wedding again. That was deliberate. For most of my life, silence on my part had been interpreted as consent. This time I wanted to see what would happen if I simply stopped participating without announcing my withdrawal. The answer came quickly. My mother called again 2 days later. Same tone, same careful warmth. "We're finalizing the seating," she said, as if continuing a conversation we'd never agreed to have. "Your brother wants something intimate, you understand." I let the pause stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. "Are you asking me something?" I finally said. She hesitated. "I'm explaining." "No," I replied. "You're justifying." Her breath caught. "Why are you being so cold?" I didn't answer that either. After we hung up, I wrote the word cold on a sticky note and placed it on my desk. Not as an insult, as a data point. Anytime I stopped absorbing discomfort, I was labeled detached, difficult, cold. That was useful information. At work, I was preparing for a routine contract renewal with a mid-size client. I'd handled their account for years, reliable, predictable, low drama. The meeting should have been straightforward. Instead, the client mentioned something casually that made my stomach tighten. "I assume your father will still be overseeing the family side of things," he said. I blinked. "I'm sorry." He looked confused. "The holding company, your family's, he's always been the final sign-off." I kept my face neutral, but my mind was already moving. "I manage this account independently," I said carefully. He nodded, unconvinced. "Of course, but I was told the structure hadn't changed." After the meeting, I went straight to our internal database. I searched for my name, then my father's. There it was. An outdated organizational note listing my role as provisional with final authority, deferred to a family entity I hadn't worked with in years. It wasn't malicious. It was worse. It was convenient. No one had bothered to update it because no one had expected me to challenge it. I forwarded the file to legal and requested an immediate correction. No explanation, no emotion, just documentation. By the end of the day, it was fixed, but the damage lingered. That night, I pulled old files from my personal records. Tax statements, correspondence, documents I had signed without thinking too hard about the implications because I trusted the people involved. Patterns emerged, not dramatic ones, subtle ones, small decisions made without me, updates communicated after the fact, authority framed as protection. I thought back to holidays where plans changed last minute, and I was told it was easier this way. To birthdays where my preferences were overridden because someone else felt more strongly. I had mistaken accommodation for love. The realization didn't hurt as much as I expected. It steadied me. On Friday, my brother texted for the first time since the invitation incident. "Hope you're doing okay. It's been hectic." I stared at the message for a long time. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't explained. He hadn't invited me. I typed a response, then erased it. Typed again. Finally, I wrote, "I'm fine, busy too." He reacted with a thumbs up. That was it. That was when it clicked. This wasn't a misunderstanding between us. It was alignment. They were all in agreement. My absence made things smoother. I spent the weekend alone. No calls, no visits, just space. On Sunday afternoon, I drove to a quiet park outside the city, sat on a bench overlooking the river, watched families pass by, couples, children, laughter that carried without effort. I wasn't sad. I was thinking. Specifically, I was thinking about leverage. Every relationship has it. It doesn't have to be malicious. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes financial. Sometimes it's just history. In my family, leverage had always flowed in one direction. They made decisions. I adapted. They withheld information. I filled in the gaps. They defined harmony. I complied. But now something had changed. They had made a visible choice without consulting me. And in doing so, they had revealed something important. They didn't fear my reaction. They assumed it. They assumed I would absorb it quietly the way I always had. That assumption was their blind spot. That evening I made a list, not of grievances, of facts. I was financially independent. I had legal standing separate from my family. I was professionally established. I had access to counsel through my firm's network. I wasn't powerless. I had just never tested the edges of my autonomy because I believed I didn't need to. The wedding was still 3 weeks away. I hadn't decided what I would do yet. But I knew one thing with certainty. I wasn't going to ask to be included. The moment they decided for me, they forfeited the right to negotiate my presence. Whatever came next wouldn't be loud. It would be precise. And once I moved, they wouldn't be able to pretend this was just about a guest list anymore. Because small decisions left unchallenged have a way of becoming permanent. I wasn't going to let this one pass unnoticed. The week after that, my father called. Not to talk about the wedding, not to explain anything, to ask me for a favor. That was how it always worked. Silence until they needed something. Then a casual reach out as if nothing had shifted. "Hey," he said, voice steady, businesslike. "I need you to review something for me." I didn't answer immediately. "What kind of something?" I asked. "A contract," he replied. "Just a quick look. You're better at this than anyone." There it was, the compliment that only surfaced when my usefulness did. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling of my office. Outside, the city moved through another gray afternoon traffic, humming, people living their lives, unaware of the quiet recalibration happening in mine. "Send it to legal," I said. A pause. "I'd rather have your eyes on it first," he said. "It's sensitive." Sensitive meant family business. "I don't work on things I'm not part of," I replied. Another pause, longer this time. "You're being difficult," he said finally. "No," I said calmly. "I'm being consistent." He exhaled sharply. "This isn't the time for boundaries." "It's the only time boundaries matter," I replied. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there for a moment, my phone still warm in my hand. That was the first door I closed on purpose. The reaction was immediate, though indirect. Later that afternoon, my mother emailed me. Not about the call, not about the contract. About my tone. She wrote that I seemed distant lately, that she was worried I was pulling away from the family, that she hoped I would reconsider the path I was choosing. I read it twice, then once more slowly. Not a word about excluding me, not a word about the wedding, not a word about making decisions without me. Just concern, carefully curated and completely detached from accountability. I didn't respond. That night, I pulled more documents from storage, old emails, financial disclosures, notes from meetings I'd attended years ago when my role in the family business was still framed as involvement. A pattern sharpened. I had been included when my skills were needed, excluded when decisions were made, and reassured afterward that everything had been handled for my own good. It wasn't chaos. It was governance. And governance always leaves a paper trail. The next morning, I took a personal day. I met with a lawyer recommended by a colleague. Not a family lawyer, not someone with history. Neutral, precise. I told her the story without emotion. Dates, actions, omissions. She listened without interrupting, then asked a question no one in my family ever had. "What do you want to protect?" she asked. Not "what do you want back?" Not "how do you want to fix this?" Protect. My autonomy, I said after a moment, and my professional standing. She nodded. Then the first step is separating those from family influence. Formally. I felt something loosen in my chest. Formal meant real. We discussed options, limited ones, clean ones. No drama, no ultimatums. Documentation, clarification, distance. When I left her office, I didn't feel empowered. I felt calm. At home, I found a message from my brother waiting. "Mom says you're upset. We're all stressed. Let's not make this worse." I read it once. Then I replied, "I'm not upset. I'm paying attention." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Nothing came after. That silence told me more than any argument would have. He wasn't confused. He just didn't want to engage in a conversation where he might lose his position. The following weekend, my parents hosted a small dinner. Extended family. A trial run, probably before the wedding. I wasn't invited. I knew because my cousin texted me afterward asking if I was okay. I didn't ask what had been said. I already knew. That was the night I made a decision. Not emotional, not reactive. Structural. I would no longer allow my professional credibility to be anchored to people who treated my presence as optional. The next Monday, I sent a formal request to disentangle my name from any shared entities committees or advisory roles connected to my family. It was polite, direct, unambiguous. I CC'd my lawyer. By noon, my father had called 3 times. I didn't answer. My mother left a voicemail, her voice tight with restrained anger. "You're forcing our hand," she said. I deleted it. At work, the legal team confirmed receipt of my request and scheduled a review. The machinery had started moving. That night, alone in my apartment, I poured a glass of water and sat by the window. I thought about how often I had been told family comes first. What no one ever explained was what happens when family uses that phrase to justify control. I wasn't attacking them. I wasn't asking for inclusion. I was stepping out of a system that relied on my silence to function. And once silence is withdrawn, even gently, systems start to creak. The wedding was 2 weeks away. They still hadn't asked me to come. I didn't need them to. Something more important had already happened. I had closed the first door, and I didn't feel the urge to reopen it. The first consequence arrived quietly, not as an apology, not as a confrontation, as inconvenience. 2 days after I submitted the request to disentangle my name from shared entities, my father's assistant called my office. She sounded nervous, overly polite, the way people do when they're standing between authority and uncertainty. "Hi," she said. "I'm calling to confirm whether you're still authorized to sign off on the quarterly compliance review." "I'm not," I replied. "That authority was provisional. I formally withdrew." There was a pause, paper shuffling. "Oh," she said, "we weren't aware." "That's why it's in writing," I answered. She thanked me and hung up. By the end of the day, 3 similar calls came in. Different people, same confusion. I didn't enjoy it, but I noticed it. At home that night, my phone finally lit up with a message from my father that wasn't a demand. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I didn't know what to say, because I knew exactly what would happen if I answered. He wouldn't ask how I felt. He wouldn't acknowledge the wedding. He would talk about logistics, damage control, how my decision complicated things. He would frame my autonomy as disruption. I didn't reply. The next morning, my mother showed up at my apartment. Unannounced, of course. I opened the door and found her standing there with a tight smile, purse clutched close to her chest, like armor. She looked past me into the apartment, immediately scanning for signs of instability. "You look tired," she said. "I'm busy," I replied. She stepped inside without asking. I let her. I wanted to see how she would navigate a space she no longer controlled. "We need to talk about what you're doing," she said, sitting at the table like it still belonged to her. "This has gone too far." I leaned against the counter. "You started this." Her eyes flashed. "We protected you." "No," I said calmly. "You managed me." "That's unfair," she snapped. "I wasn't consulted," I said. "I was informed after decisions were made." She waved a hand dismissively. "We didn't think you'd handle it well." I nodded slowly. "And you didn't ask." She opened her mouth, then closed it. That silence told me everything. "You're risking your relationship with us," she said finally. I met her gaze. "You already did." Her face tightened. "You're punishing us." "No," I said. "I'm opting out." She stood abruptly. "Your father is furious." "I know," I replied. She shook her head, incredulous. "You're being cold." There it was again. Cold, distant, difficult. The words they used when I stopped cushioning their comfort. She left without another word. By Friday, the ripple effects were unmistakable. A compliance review my father had expected to sail through was delayed due to missing signatures. A partner called him directly instead of routing things through family channels. He didn't like that. Evan texted me late that night. "Dad's under a lot of pressure. You didn't have to do this." I read the message twice. Then I replied. "I did." He didn't answer. The wedding was 10 days away. My absence had become a topic. Not openly, not directly, but I could feel it in the way people reached out carefully, as if approaching a fracture they didn't want to name. My aunt called asking if everything was okay. A cousin sent a vague message about hoping things worked out. A family friend mentioned stress, family dynamics, the importance of unity. No one asked why I wasn't invited. That omission was loud. At work, something else happened. The legal team confirmed my separation request and asked whether I wanted to proceed with a full audit of any projects previously co-signed by family entities. I hadn't expected that. "Yes," I said after a moment. It wasn't revenge. It was risk management. If my name had been used to lend credibility to decisions I didn't make, that needed to be documented. Cleanly, professionally. That afternoon, my father called again. This time I answered. "What are you trying to prove?" he asked without preamble. "I'm not proving anything," I said. "I'm clarifying." "You're humiliating us," he snapped. "I'm not speaking publicly," I replied. "I'm handling my affairs. You're making us look divided." I took a breath. "You excluded me." "That was different," he said. I almost laughed. "Because you decided it was," I said. "That doesn't make it neutral." There was a long pause. "You're overreacting," he said finally. "No," I replied. "I'm responding proportionally." He hung up. The call left me strangely calm. Because I understood something then. They weren't upset about my feelings. They were upset about friction. My silence used to smooth things over. My compliance used to absorb tension. Without it, their systems slowed. Their authority required explanation. And that was intolerable to them. The night before the wedding, I went for a walk along the river. The city was alive with weekend noise. Laughter, music, people heading somewhere they were expected. I wasn't. I checked my phone once. No invitation, no last-minute outreach, no attempt to mend anything. Just a photo posted by my mother. "Rehearsal dinner tonight. So grateful for family." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then locked my phone and put it away. That was the final confirmation. They hadn't forgotten me. They had chosen. And so had I. The wedding would happen without me. But something else was already in motion. Something they hadn't planned for. Silence had started to cost them. And I was no longer interested in making it easier. The wedding happened on a Saturday. I know because my phone stayed quiet all morning, then lit up around noon with photos I didn't ask for. A cousin sent one by accident, then quickly followed with sorry wrong chat. White flowers, smiling faces. My brother in a tailored suit, my parents beaming like nothing had ever fractured. I looked at the photo once, then deleted it. I didn't feel excluded anymore. I felt relieved. Because the moment that ceremony began without me, something subtle but permanent changed. I was no longer a background character waiting to be written back in. I had been written out publicly. That matters. People think exclusion is painful because of what you miss. In reality, it hurts because of what it reveals. Once something is done openly, there's no plausible deniability left. No pretending it was a misunderstanding. They had drawn a line. I spent that Saturday doing errands. Normal things. Groceries. Laundry. A long walk through a neighborhood I was thinking of moving into. The world didn't collapse. No one stopped me to ask why I wasn't at a wedding. Life kept going. That night the calls started. Not from my parents. From people adjacent to them. An uncle. A family friend. Someone who worked closely with my father. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Concern. Confusion. A gentle attempt to coax me back into position. Your parents are worried. This has gotten out of hand. Family shouldn't be handled like a business. I listened. I didn't argue. And I didn't explain. Because explanation is a form of labor and I was done working for free. The first real shift came the following Monday. I arrived at work to find an email from our compliance department flagged as urgent. During the audit of projects I had previously co-signed, they had identified discrepancies, nothing illegal, but enough procedural ambiguity to require clarification. Specifically, several decisions attributed to me had been finalized during periods when I was not consulted or present. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear, recognition. This was the risk I'd been managing without realizing it. I forwarded the email to my lawyer. She replied within minutes. This is why you separated. We'll document everything. That afternoon, my father showed up at my office, unannounced. Security called first to ask if he was expected. I said no. They asked if I wanted him escorted out. I said no. I wanted to see his face when he realized the ground rules had changed. He walked in like he owned the place, suit crisp, jaw tight. You blindsided us, he said. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. He didn't sit. I withdrew from shared authority, I said. In writing. You knew this would cause problems, he snapped. Yes, I replied. That's why I did it. He stared at me as if I'd spoken another language. You've always been dramatic, he said. This is just another example. I leaned back in my chair. This isn't drama, it's risk mitigation. He scoffed. You think lawyers fix everything? No, I said. They clarify responsibility. He finally sat down. Do you have any idea what this is doing to us? He asked. I looked at him steadily. Do you have any idea what it's been doing to me? Silence. He didn't answer. Because he didn't care. Not in the way that required accountability. You're not thinking long-term, he said. You're burning bridges. I shook my head. I'm removing myself from structures that assumed my consent. You're making enemies, he warned. I'm making distance, I replied. There's a difference. He stood abruptly. You won't always be able to do this alone. I met his gaze. I already have. He left without another word. That was the moment I understood something critical. My value to them had never been emotional. It had been functional. I smoothed, I signed, I absorbed, I validated. The moment I stopped doing that, concern turned into anger. Not because they missed me, because they missed my usefulness. That night, I reviewed the audit notes carefully. With my lawyer. Line by line, we documented timelines, email gaps, decision points where my name had been applied without my input. Not to accuse, to protect. By the end of the week, the compliance team issued an internal clarification. I was formally removed from responsibility for decisions made without my direct authorization. Clean, professional, non-negotiable. My phone buzzed late Friday night, a message from my mother. This is tearing the family apart. I stared at the screen. Then I typed back. No, it's exposing it. She didn't reply. The following days were quiet. Too quiet. No more outreach, no more guilt-laced concern. They had moved into a new phase. Containment. I could feel it in the way people stopped calling, in the way information dried up, in the sudden absence of pressure. They were regrouping. And that told me something important. When people stop trying to persuade you, it's because they're looking for another way to control the outcome. I wasn't done yet, but I was done being useful. And without that, they had very little leverage left. The silence didn't last. It never does. When pressure stops working, control changes shape. It becomes softer, kinder, concerned. Containment doesn't arrive as force, it arrives as care. My mother was the first to try. She didn't call, she didn't text. She sent flowers. A simple arrangement, white lilies, no note, just my name neatly printed on the card. I stared at them longer than I should have. Flowers had always been her way of resetting the tone without addressing the issue. A gesture that implied reconciliation without requiring accountability. An offering meant to make refusal feel cruel. I didn't send a thank you. I let them sit untouched until they wilted. 2 days later, she emailed, "I'm worried about you. You seem isolated. I hope you're taking care of yourself." I read it once. Concern framed carefully, stripped of context. No mention of the wedding. No mention of my father showing up at my office. No mention of authority assumed and revoked. Just worry. I didn't reply. That afternoon, my brother reached out. Not directly to me, to my lawyer. He asked whether I was open to informal discussion about clearing misunderstandings. He suggested mediation family style. No records, no filings, just conversation. My lawyer forwarded the message with a short note. This is an attempt to regain access without restoring accountability. She wasn't wrong. I told her to respond that all communication would remain formal and documented. Evan didn't like that. He left me a voicemail that night, his voice low and frustrated. "You don't have to do everything through lawyers," he said. "We're family." I listened to the message once, then I deleted it. Family, when invoked at moments like this, is rarely about connection. It's about leverage. The next move came from my father. A proposal. He sent it through counsel this time, which told me two things. One, he was taking this seriously now. Two, he wanted control back. The proposal outlined a restructuring of shared interests. Not equal, not transparent, but generous enough to appear conciliatory. They would reinstate my name on select entities, offer me a defined advisory role, include me publicly in future family events. In exchange, I would halt audits, withdraw separation requests, and sign a non-disclosure agreement. I read it slowly. This wasn't an apology. It was a containment strategy. Bring me back inside the structure, redefine my role, limit my speech, restore appearances. They weren't offering respect. They were offering proximity. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair. That night, I went for a long walk. No music, no phone. Just the rhythm of my steps and the city settling around me. I thought about how often I'd been told growing up that compromise was maturity, that flexibility was kindness, that letting things go was strength. What no one ever said was that compromise only works when both sides have equal power. Otherwise, it's submission with better branding. By the time I got home, my decision was made. The next morning, my lawyer sent a response. Polite, brief, unemotional. I declined, not countered. Declined. I wasn't negotiating terms inside a system that had already proven it would use me when convenient and exclude me when not. Within hours, my father called. I didn't answer. He left a message, his voice tight. "You're making a mistake. This could have been handled quietly." Quietly. That word again. Quiet had always been the expectation. Quiet compliance, quiet acceptance, quiet disappearance. I wasn't loud now, but I wasn't quiet either. At work, something shifted. Colleagues who had previously been cautious around me began to speak more openly. They asked questions, included me earlier in discussions, trusted my judgment without filtering it through assumed family influence. One senior partner said something offhand that stuck with me. "It's good to see you standing independently," she said. "It clarifies things." Clarifies. That was the word. I wasn't burning bridges. I was removing fog. By the end of the week, my parents stopped reaching out entirely. No calls, no messages, no gestures. The kindness had been a test. I had failed it, which meant the next phase wouldn't be gentle. Containment had failed. And when containment fails, people move to consequences. I knew something was coming. I just didn't know from which direction. But for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't bracing. I was ready. Because the moment I declined their offer, I took back something they'd never intended to give me. The right to say no without justification. Whatever came next, it would have to meet me there. And I had no intention of stepping back inside their version of peace ever again. The consequences didn't arrive as threats. They arrived as stories. I noticed it first through other people. Subtle shifts in tone, conversations that started with concern and ended with caution. A colleague asking a little too carefully if everything was okay at home. An old family friend mentioning stress, misunderstanding how hard this must be for my parents. No one accused me directly. They didn't have to. Narratives don't need confrontation to do damage, they just need repetition. My mother was very good at that. She never said I was wrong. She said I was overwhelmed. She never said I was selfish. She said I was sensitive. She never said I was ungrateful. She said I was struggling. It was a familiar move. Frame dissent as distress, turn boundaries into symptoms, make control look like care. I recognized it because I'd lived inside it for years. The first concrete sign came when a mutual acquaintance forwarded me an email thread by mistake. My name appeared halfway down. "She's under a lot of pressure," my mother had written. "We're worried she's making decisions she'll regret. We just want to protect her." Protect. I stared at the word until it lost meaning. I didn't respond to the acquaintance. I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I called my lawyer. "They're reframing," I said. "I know," she replied. "That's predictable." "What do we do?" I asked. "We document," she said, "and we narrow exposure." That afternoon, we filed a formal notice clarifying that any statements made on my behalf, personal or professional, without my authorization were inaccurate. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't public. It was preventative. It drew a line between my voice and theirs. At work, I requested that all external communication referencing my role or decisions be routed through me directly. No intermediaries, no assumptions, no family context. The response was immediate and supportive, which surprised me. I had spent years assuming my family's presence lent me credibility. What I was learning now was the opposite. Their presence had blurred it. The next move came from Evan. He called late one night, his voice lower than usual, careful. "They're saying you've cut them off completely," he said, "that you won't even talk." "That's not true," I replied. "I'm communicating through counsel." "That makes it sound hostile," he said. "It makes it accurate," I replied. He sighed. "You're isolating yourself." "No," I said, "I'm choosing structure." He didn't like that answer. "They're worried about how this looks," he said. "People are asking questions." I almost laughed. "People should," I said. "Questions are healthy." He was quiet for a moment. "You know they're framing this as you rejecting the family," he said. "I didn't reject anyone," I replied. "I declined control." "That's not how it feels to them," he said. "That's not my responsibility," I said. The line went silent. When he spoke again, his voice was sharper. "You're burning everything down," he said. "No," I replied calmly. "I'm stepping out of the fire." He hung up. That weekend, my mother posted a photo on social media. Just her and my father, smiling, hands clasped, a caption about resilience and love and standing together during difficult times. No names, no context. The comments filled in the gaps for her. "So strong. Family is everything. Sending prayers during this season." I scrolled once, then closed the app. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about optics. They weren't trying to fix the fracture. They were trying to own the narrative of it. That's when I understood the next step had to be proactive, not reactive. I asked my lawyer about a formal declaration. She nodded. "A statement of separation," she said. "Factual, limited, on record." "What does that do?" I asked. "It removes ambiguity," she said. "It prevents others from speaking for you." We drafted it together. No accusations, no emotional language, just facts. I had been excluded from a significant family event without consultation. I had requested formal separation of professional and financial authority. All decisions moving forward were independent. It wasn't a press release. It was a record. We filed it. The response was immediate. My father's attorney called mine within the hour. They wanted to discuss tone. My lawyer declined. My mother emailed me directly. "How could you humiliate us like this?" I didn't reply. Evan texted again. "You're making us look like villains." I typed back one sentence. "I didn't write the story. I stopped letting you write it for me." He didn't respond. By Monday morning, the reframing attempts slowed. Not because they stopped trying, because the ambiguity they relied on was gone. You can't quietly recast someone as unstable when there's a clear documented trail of decisions and boundaries. Clarity is inconvenient that way. At work, the atmosphere shifted again. People stopped asking questions about my family. They focused on results, performance, direction. That was the environment I thrived in. Not one built on implication, one built on evidence. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat at the table with a notebook and wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. They needed me confused. I became clear. I realized then that this wasn't just about this moment, or this conflict. It was about every time I'd been softened, reframed, or spoken over for the sake of harmony. They had mistaken my restraint for agreement. They had mistaken my silence for consent. They had mistaken my loyalty for availability. And now they were discovering what happens when that mistake is corrected. The wedding was over. Containment had failed. Reframing had stalled. There was only one move left: escalation. And when it came, I wouldn't be surprised. Because once you stop letting people control the story, they either let go or they push harder. I was ready for either, but I knew which one they'd choose. Escalation doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives disguised as order. The first sign came in the form of a letter from a firm I didn't recognize. Heavy paper, formal tone, addressed to me by full legal name. It informed me that certain family-related records might be subject to review due to concerns raised by interested parties. Interested parties. That phrase is doing a lot of work. I read the letter twice, then called my lawyer. "They're fishing," she said after a brief pause. "They're hoping to unsettle you, or prompt a mistake." "Do they have standing?" I asked. "Not really," she said, "but they're trying to create the impression of scrutiny." Impression, optics, narrative. The same tools, just deployed in a different room. We responded with a request for clarification. Narrow, precise. No volunteering of information. No emotional language. Within hours, the firm withdrew the inquiry. That told me everything. It wasn't about risk. It was about pressure. The next move came from inside the family business. A former colleague called me late one afternoon, his voice tight. "I thought you should know," he said. "Your father's asking questions about projects you worked on years ago. He's framing them as unresolved." Unresolved, how, I asked. "Not illegal," he said quickly. "Just vague, enough to imply uncertainty." I closed my eyes for a moment. They weren't trying to accuse me. They were trying to destabilize me, to make me defensive, reactive, distracted. That's how control is reasserted when direct access is gone. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Please forward anything in writing." He hesitated. "I don't want to be caught in the middle." "You already are," I replied gently. "You're just choosing where to stand." He sent the email 10 minutes later. That night, I reviewed old files again. Not because I was worried, but because I wanted to be prepared. Every project, every approval, every decision point. The record was clean. Not perfect, nothing ever is, but documented, accountable, traceable. That's the thing about people who rely on implication. They rarely expect receipts. 2 days later, my mother tried a different approach. She didn't contact me directly. She reached out to someone I trusted. My grandmother. I got the call on a quiet Sunday morning. Her voice was soft, careful, the way it always was when she didn't want to take sides. "Your mother is worried," she said. "She thinks this has gone too far." I didn't respond immediately. "I know you're strong," my grandmother continued. "But family is complicated. Sometimes it's better to let things settle." I looked out the window, watching rain trace thin lines down the glass. "What does settling look like?" I asked. She paused. "Forgiveness." I chose my words carefully. "I can forgive without re-entering a structure that harmed me," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." She sighed. "Your parents feel shut out." "I was shut out," I replied, quietly, without discussion. "That was different," she said. I didn't argue. I just said "I love you" and ended the call. I wasn't angry. I was aware. This was the final escalation strategy. Emotional triangulation. If they couldn't reach me directly, they would reroute through people whose concern I still valued. Not to resolve anything, but to soften my boundaries through guilt. I recognized it immediately, because it had worked before. It didn't work now. At work, something unexpected happened. The compliance team completed their review of historical projects and issued a formal memo clearing my name of any ambiguity. They noted procedural irregularities, but none attributable to me. The memo went into the record. My lawyer smiled when she read it. "This is what happens when you stay factual," she said. "Emotion fades, paper doesn't." That afternoon, my father called again. I answered. His voice was controlled, too controlled. "This is becoming public," he said. "Not by me," I replied. "People are drawing conclusions," he continued. "They should," I said. "You're damaging the family," he said. I took a breath. "You damaged the family when you decided I was a liability instead of a person," I replied. "I'm just no longer absorbing the fallout." He was quiet. "You don't understand the consequences," he said finally. "I understand them perfectly," I replied. "I just don't fear them anymore." He hung up. That was the moment I knew something fundamental had shifted. They had tried exclusion. They had tried containment. They had tried reframing. They had tried escalation through implication and emotion. And none of it had brought me back into position, because the position itself was the problem. That night, I sat at my desk and reviewed the last remaining shared document that tied me to them. A legacy designation. Something symbolic but not insignificant. I had left it untouched until now, not out of fear, out of timing. I signed the withdrawal form digitally, sent it to my lawyer. copied no one else. It wasn't dramatic, but it was irreversible. When you remove the last thread that allows someone to speak for you, you don't just change the dynamic. You end it. I shut my laptop and leaned back, letting the quiet settle. Escalation hadn't broken me. It had clarified everything. They had done everything they could to regain control. And in doing so, they had proven why I could never give it back. The next step wouldn't be theirs. It would be mine. And it wouldn't involve explaining myself at all. The moment I removed my name from the last shared document, the noise stopped. Not immediately, not dramatically, but cleanly. No more indirect messages. No more concerned inquiries routed through other people. No more subtle attempts to reopen conversation under the guise of care. It was as if a switch had been flipped somewhere I couldn't see. Dana explained it the next morning. "You've moved from uncertainty to finality," she said. "They can't negotiate ambiguity. They need it." I sat at my desk, hands folded, listening to the quiet hum of the office around me. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now," she said, "they decide whether to accept reality or try to rewrite it in court." I knew which one they'd choose. 2 days later, the letter arrived. This one wasn't fishing. It wasn't vague. It wasn't dressed up as concern. It was formal notice. My parents were contesting the separation on the grounds of emotional duress and temporary instability. They weren't accusing me of wrongdoing. They were questioning my capacity. It was strategic. If they could reframe my choices as impaired judgment, they could reopen doors I had closed. I didn't panic. I didn't react. I read the letter carefully, then forwarded it to Dana with one line: "Proceed." That afternoon, we filed a response. Not defensive, declarative. It included documentation of my employment history, independent financial standing, prior professional evaluations, and the full timeline of events leading up to my withdrawal. Dates, communications, decisions made without consultation. We didn't argue their claims. We rendered them irrelevant. Capacity isn't proven by emotion. It's proven by consistency. At work, I informed my supervisor of the situation. Not because I owed an explanation, but because transparency removes leverage. She listened quietly, then said something that surprised me. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "It confirms what I already see." "What's that?" I asked. "That you're measured," she replied. "People who lose control don't document their exits." I smiled. That night, Evan showed up at my apartment. I hadn't told him where I lived. He must have asked. I opened the door and found him standing there, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight. "They're taking this to court," he said. "I know," I replied. "This doesn't have to happen," he said. "You can stop it." I looked at him for a long moment. "By doing what I asked. By coming back," he said. "By talking to them. By admitting you went too far." There it was. Return, apologize, resume position. "I didn't go anywhere," I said. "I stepped out." He shook his head. "You're tearing everything apart." I stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. He didn't. "Do you remember when I asked to be part of the planning?" I asked. He frowned. "What planning?" "The wedding," I said. "The business transitions. Any of it." He opened his mouth, then closed it. "You never noticed because you were never excluded," I continued. "You were centered." "That's not fair," he said. "It's factual," I replied. He looked away. "They think you're punishing them," he said quietly. "I'm not," I replied. "I'm refusing to be managed." He swallowed. "If you let this go to court, it'll get ugly." I nodded. "I know." "And you're okay with that?" he asked. I met his gaze. "I'm okay with the truth being recorded." He stood there for a long moment, then nodded once. "I don't recognize you," he said. "That's because you never saw me without compliance," I replied. He left without another word. The court date was set quickly. Not a trial, a hearing, limited scope. The question wasn't whether I loved my family. The question was whether I had the right to disengage without being pathologized for it. The night before, I slept deeply. No rehearsed arguments, no imagined confrontations. Just rest. In the courtroom, everything was subdued. Neutral walls, polite voices, process. My parents sat across from me. They didn't look angry. They looked confused, as if they couldn't understand why the old tools weren't working. Their attorney spoke first. He emphasized concern, protection, history. Dana responded with facts, timelines, documentation, absence of coercion. When the judge asked me a question directly, it was simple. "Do you believe you are capable of making these decisions independently?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "Do you feel pressured by your family to change them?" she asked. "Yes," I said. The room went quiet. The judge nodded slowly. "I see no evidence of incapacity," she said. "I see evidence of disagreement." She ruled in my favor. Not dramatically, decisively. The separation stood. No further review. No reopening without cause. Outside the building, my parents didn't approach me. Evan didn't look back. Dana shook my hand. "You chose the hardest clean exit," she said. "Most people don't." I didn't choose hard, I replied. I chose final. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat on the floor and let the quiet settle. Not relief, not victory, just certainty. Because there are moments in life where you stop asking whether you're allowed to leave and start recognizing that staying was the real risk all along. This was one of them, and I wasn't going back. The ruling didn't change my life overnight. It changed the temperature. The constant, low-grade pressure I had lived with for years evaporated, and in its place was something unfamiliar but welcome. Neutral ground, no assumptions, no expectations attached to my name. The first week after the hearing, nothing happened. No calls, no emails, no indirect messages routed through people who meant well but carried other people's agendas. That absence was the confirmation. When control fails completely, there's no graceful fallback. There's only retreat. At work, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Projects that had once required extra layers of approval moved faster. Conversations that had been careful became direct. I was invited into decisions earlier, not because of family connections, but because I had proven I could stand alone without destabilizing the room. One afternoon, my supervisor stopped by my office. I wanted to check in, she said. How are you holding up? I considered the question. Clear, I replied. She smiled. That tracks. She didn't ask for details. She didn't offer sympathy. She trusted my answer. That mattered more than she knew. Outside of work, my life grew quieter. Not smaller, just less crowded with other people's expectations. I changed my routine. Morning walks instead of scrolling. Cooking meals instead of grabbing something fast because I was distracted. I slept better, deeper. When you stop bracing for impact, your body notices before your mind does. 2 weeks after the ruling, my mother sent one final email. It wasn't long. I don't recognize you anymore. I hope one day you remember who you are. I read it once, then I archived it. I knew exactly who I was. That message wasn't grief. It was disorientation. She had lost access to the version of me that made her feel competent and in control. The quiet one, the flexible one, the one who absorbed discomfort and called it love. That version wasn't coming back. Around that time, I learned something else. A restructuring had taken place inside the family business. My father stepped back from several advisory roles. Evan assumed more responsibility, not triumphantly, carefully. It wasn't a punishment, it was exposure. Without me smoothing transitions and absorbing friction, the systems they relied on had to adjust, not collapse, adjust. And adjustment is uncomfortable for people who mistake stability for authority. I wasn't invited into that process. I didn't need to be. The distance I had created wasn't a void. It was a boundary. One evening while cleaning out a drawer, I found an old notebook from years ago. Pages filled with half-finished thoughts, plans I never followed through on because they didn't fit the life I was quietly being guided toward. I flipped through it slowly. There was no bitterness, just curiosity. I tore out one page and pinned it above my desk, not as a promise, as a reminder that I had once imagined a future without asking permission. I was living that future now. Evan reached out once more a month later, not to argue, not to persuade, just a short message. I didn't know it would go this far. I stared at it for a long time before replying. Neither did I. That was all I sent. He didn't respond. That was the last time we spoke. The final shift came quietly, the way most real endings do. I stopped thinking about what they might be saying about me. I stopped checking social media for context clues. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. When people asked about my family, I said, "We're not in contact, and let that be enough." I didn't soften it. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't apologize for it. The urge to justify fades when you realize the people who demand explanations are rarely satisfied by them. Late one night, sitting alone with a cup of tea, I wrote something down. Not for anyone else, for myself. I wrote, "I was never difficult. I was inconvenient." That truth landed softly, then settled. The story I had lived under for so long had cast me as the problem. Too sensitive, too intense, too much. But what I had really been was resistant to control even when I didn't know how to name it. They sensed it. That's why they managed me instead of listening to me. That's why exclusion felt easier than negotiation. I didn't feel anger anymore. Anger requires proximity. What I felt instead was distance with integrity. There is a difference between cutting people off and stepping away. One is reactive, the other is deliberate. I hadn't lost my family. I had lost access to a system that required my silence to function. And in exchange, I had gained something far more stable. Choice. The next chapter of my life wasn't going to be louder, it wasn't going to be dramatic. It was going to be mine. And that was enough. The weeks after everything settled were quieter than I expected. Not empty, not lonely. Just unoccupied. For the first time in years, my calendar wasn't shaped around other people's needs. No family obligations disguised as traditions. No last-minute requests framed as emergencies. No emotional weather forecasts I had to check before deciding how honest I could be. I didn't realize how much mental space that freed until it was mine. I began to notice small things. How my shoulders dropped when my phone rang, and it wasn't one of them. How I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. How my decisions felt cleaner when they didn't need to pass through an invisible approval process first. At work, the difference became visible. Not because I worked harder, I didn't. Because I worked clearer. I stopped over-explaining in meetings. I stated conclusions without cushioning them. When I disagreed, I didn't rush to soften the impact. I trusted my judgment enough to let it stand without defense. People responded to that. A senior director pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "You're more decisive lately. It's noticeable." I nodded. I have fewer voices in my head. She smiled like she understood more than she let on. Outside the office, I rebuilt my routines deliberately. Morning walks, cooking meals instead of rushing through them. Evenings without background noise. I wasn't trying to reinvent myself. I was letting myself arrive. There was grief in that process, but it wasn't loud. It came in flashes. A memory triggered by a song. A familiar recipe I didn't feel like making anymore. A holiday advertisement that assumed everyone was gathering somewhere. I let those moments pass without forcing meaning onto them. Grief doesn't always need processing. Sometimes it just needs permission. One afternoon, I ran into someone who used to know my parents well. She looked at me carefully, then said, "You seem lighter." "I am," I replied. She hesitated. "I hope everything's okay at home." I met her gaze. "It is." That was the truth. Not because things were reconciled, but because they were resolved. Resolution doesn't require agreement, it requires clarity. I hadn't heard from my parents since the ruling. No attempts to reach out, no apologies, no explanations. That told me something important. They hadn't changed. They had simply lost leverage. I thought about that often. How many relationships persist, not because they are healthy, but because one side absorbs more than the other is willing to acknowledge. Remove that absorption and the structure reveals itself quickly. Evan's absence was easier than I expected. I missed the idea of a brother more than the reality of him. The version of him that might have stood beside me if the cost hadn't been so high. I didn't demonize him. I just stopped imagining an alternative version of him that had never existed. That was another form of letting go. One night, while cleaning out old files, I came across emails from years ago. Messages where I'd asked for clarity, for inclusion, for a voice. The responses were polite, vague, reassuring, without committing to anything concrete. I read them now with a different lens. Not anger. Recognition. I hadn't failed to communicate. I had been managed. That distinction mattered. I deleted the files. Not to erase the past, to stop carrying it forward. As winter approached, the city slowed. Early darkness, quieter streets, fewer distractions. I found myself sitting more often doing nothing productive, just thinking, not about what I'd lost, about what I was building. I began exploring opportunities I'd once dismissed as impractical, a role in a different division, a potential relocation, possibilities that required me to prioritize my own trajectory instead of orbiting someone else's. The idea didn't scare me. That was new. Fear had kept me tethered for years. Fear of disappointing, fear of conflict, fear of being labeled ungrateful. Without that fear, the horizon widened. One evening I wrote a list. Not goals, not plans. Boundaries. I wrote what I would no longer do. I would no longer explain my decisions to earn approval. I would no longer accept concern without accountability. I would no longer confuse proximity with care. The list wasn't long, but it was final. The last time my mother's words echoed in my head was unexpectedly mundane. I was standing in line at a cafe when the barista got my order wrong. My instinct was to apologize for the inconvenience. Then I stopped. I corrected him calmly. He fixed it without issue. As I walked away, coffee in hand, I realized how deep the reflex went. How often I had taken responsibility for situations I hadn't created. How often I had made myself smaller to keep things smooth. I didn't feel embarrassed. I felt free. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my journal. I wrote, I was taught that love requires endurance, that loyalty means staying quiet, that peace is something you preserve by making yourself easier to manage. What I learned instead is this: love that costs you your voice isn't love. Peace that depends on your silence isn't peace. Family that only functions when you comply isn't family. I closed the journal and leaned back. The room was quiet, steady, mine. I didn't know exactly what came next. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel dangerous. It felt honest. And honesty, I was learning, is a much better foundation than approval ever was. The story wasn't over yet, but it was finally moving forward, on my terms. The year ended without ceremony. No dramatic reconciliation, no final confrontation, no moment where everyone suddenly understood what they had done. Life doesn't usually offer that kind of symmetry. Instead, it gave me something quieter and far more durable: ownership. By December, the silence from my family had settled into something permanent. Not hostile, not tender, just absent. The space where obligation used to live was empty now, and I had stopped trying to fill it with meaning. I spent the holidays differently that year. No long drives, no tense dinners, no carefully measured responses to questions designed to test my loyalty. I stayed home. I cooked what I liked. I woke up when I wanted. I took long walks through neighborhoods lit softly with string lights, watching other people move through traditions that no longer defined me. There was a moment standing alone in my kitchen on Christmas morning when the weight of it all hit me. Not sadness, not regret. Finality, and with it relief. I thought about how many years I had spent negotiating my place, how often I had mistaken endurance for love, how frequently I had been told to be patient, to be understanding, to not take things so personally, as if exclusion weren't personal by definition, as if control were neutral when wrapped in concern. What surprised me most was how little anger I felt now. Anger requires proximity. It feeds on hope that something might still change. I no longer had that hope. And that wasn't a loss. It was clarity. In January, I accepted a new role. Different division. More responsibility. Fewer ties to the structures that had once blurred my authority. The offer came without negotiation. They wanted me exactly as I was. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't need to. For the first time, my milestones belonged solely to me. Evan never reached out again. I heard through someone else that he had stepped fully into the role my parents always envisioned for him. The center, the successor, the proof that their way worked. I wished him well. Not generously, not bitterly. Honestly, because I finally understood something that had taken me years to name. We hadn't been competing. We had been assigned different roles. His was to belong. Mine was to comply. When I stopped complying, the system had no place for me. That wasn't a failure. It was a design flaw. One evening, late winter, I found myself rereading the first pages of the notebook I'd started months earlier. The early entries were cautious, analytical, almost detached. I had been documenting my way out, afraid that if I trusted my instincts too much, I might be wrong. The last entry was different. It was short. I wrote, I didn't lose my family. I lost the version of myself that believed love had to be earned through silence. I closed the notebook and didn't open it again. There was nothing left to record. The story had done its work. If you're hearing this and recognizing pieces of yourself along the way, I want to leave you with this. Pay attention to who gets uncomfortable when you stop explaining. Notice who benefits when you doubt your own memory. Ask yourself whether the love you're protecting is reciprocal or simply familiar. You don't need to burn bridges. You don't need to win arguments. You don't need to prove you were right. Sometimes the most powerful act is choosing not to participate in what diminishes you. That's not revenge. That's self-respect. And self-respect has a way of outlasting every story that was ever told about you. If this story resonated, share it. Leave a comment about the boundary you're learning to hold, or the moment you realized silence was costing you too much. And if you want to hear more stories like this told quietly, honestly, and without spectacle, stay here. Some lives change when people apologize. Others change when you stop waiting for one. This was mine.